would you pick to be part of the next Smash Bros. DLC Fighter Pass? I asked that question in my first video, and without a doubt, many characters came to mind. It's been a while since that video came out, and needless to say, the hype for Smash DLC has kind of died down since then. Despite this, I found some free time, and in the midst of some very relevant and big gaming news, I found inspiration to make a new video. The character in this video comes from a dark, gothic fantasy series, whose installments were released around the turn of the millennium, and originate from some of the same creative minds behind the likes of Tomb Raider and the Uncharted series. This series, of course, is none other than Legacy of Kain. Now, I could make an entire video about the Legacy of Kain series just by itself. It is a milestone in video game voice acting, one of the first instances where classically trained voice actors were hired to complete the job. Its heavy focus on lore and time travel have earned it comparisons with that of the Legend of Zelda series, with developers even referring to it on a number of occasions as a dark fantasy Zelda. Even when I was playing Breath of the Wild, I would say to myself as I was gliding across Hyrule, wow, what if I had, instead of a glider, a pair of wings? And what if, instead of Hyrule, this was the land of Nosgoth? There is a wealth of content available on the Legacy of Kain series, from both its development to its lore. However, if I had to recommend one of them above them all, it would be Your Favorite Son's retrospective on the series. It's a bit of a doozy to watch, so unless you have a few hours to spare, I'd recommend watching it over the course of a few viewing sessions. The video has everything you need to know about the Legacy of Kain series and how to understand its backstory. For the purposes of this video, however, I'll just give you the gist of it. Now, I'm about to get into some major plot points in Legacy of Kain, so if you're not familiar with the series and you still want to check it out, skip to this timestamp right here. The first entry in the series is Blood Omen, Legacy of Kain. The story pretty much goes as follows. Two factions battle each other in Nosgoth's early history, with one faction sealing the other one away in an alternate dimension. But you don't know this in the first game. As a matter of fact, you don't even get a hint about this until the third game in the series. All you do know is that you're playing as Kain, a cynical, sarcastic nobleman who is on the road one night looking for an open tavern. When leaving one tavern, Kain is killed by bandits and resurrected later as a vampire. We are then introduced to the Pillars of Nosgoth, 9 marble edifices whose health is directly tied to that of the land. The pillars, you would later find out, are the aforementioned seal that was used to seal away one of the factions. But they have become corrupted and weakened, thus weakening the seal. In order to redeem the pillars and allegedly cure himself of vampirism, Kain is tasked with killing each of the 9 pillar guardians. Initially disgusted with his unlife, Kain begins to lose the remnants of his humanity and adopt a darker perspective as a vampire. Along the way, he's tricked into galvanizing an entire crusade against the vampires in Nosgoth, resulting in him ultimately becoming its last vampire. Kain kills 8 of the 9 pillar guardians, only to realize that he himself is actually the last pillar guardian. Refusing to sacrifice himself, Kain opts to allow Nosgoth to become a hellscape, which he later claims for himself. Centuries later, he exhumes the bodies of 6 holy warriors known as Sarafan, who had decimated his kind previously. The first and strongest of these knights, who he would resurrect as his vampire sons, is named Raziel. Raziel first appears in the second game in the series, Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver, which feels completely alien to the original installment. This entry is a big departure from its predecessor. Leaving behind Blood Omen's top-down gaming style, its Germanic gothic fantasy aesthetic, and color palette of mostly black and red, Soul Reaver is a 3D open-world platformer with Arabic and Hebrew influences, and more desaturated browns and greens. Raziel is Kain's right hand, the strongest of his 6 lieutenants. No lieutenant, however, is permitted to evolve before Kain. When Raziel develops a pair of bat-like wings, he presents them to Kain and the rest of the council. Seemingly out of jealousy, Kain rips his wings off, and in perhaps one of the gaming cutscenes that has stuck around with me more than any other, orders Raziel to be killed. Soul Reaver draws much of its inspiration from Milton's Paradise Lost. So if Raziel's execution evokes images of Lucifer being cast down from heaven, that is entirely intentional. Parallel to Kain's transformation in the first game, Raziel is revolted by his new appearance, and seeks vengeance against Kain and his brethren for destroying him. Now a creature of the underworld, Raziel no longer feeds on the blood of his enemies, but rather their souls. He could also shift between 2 realms of existence, the material plane, where creatures of flesh and solid matter exist, and the spectral plane, a more ephemeral, warped world, not dissimilar to a Kandinsky painting. The player would use Raziel's newfound powers and the remains of his crippled wings to overcome obstacles and puzzles throughout the game. In the game's climax, Raziel would fail to dispatch Kain and pursue him through a time portal into Nosgoth's past. The subsequent games, Soul Reaver 2 and Legacy of Kain Defiance, depict Raziel's journey through the past to kill Kain and restore the land of Nazgûl. The series put out 5 titles in its run, ultimately going on an indefinite hiatus in 2003, with its ending never truly resolved. Since then, a number of titles were pitched and, for one reason or another, cancelled, and never saw the light of day. Still, Legacy of Kain fans remain hopeful that one day the story will come to a close, and regularly, fanatically even in some cases, rave about the series' impact, both on a personal level and in the greater spheres of gaming. And now that news of Soul Reaver 1 and 2 being remastered, along with a prequel comic, have surfaced, hopes are reignited yet again for series fans. Regarding this development, I figured what better time than to dust off some old DLC animations that I made and put together a video. So without too much further introduction, here's my character moveset concept video for Legacy of Kain Soul Reavers, Raziel. Specials. Neutral Special. Raziel's neutral beat will summon or dispose of the Soul Reaver, an ethereal blade that permanently coils itself around his arm in the first Soul Reaver game. The Soul Reaver blade is an essential item in the series, first appearing in Blood Omen in its physical form. This blade is also essential to Raziel's combat, allowing him to deal devastating damage in later games. However, it is not without its drawbacks. In Smash, Raziel would only be able to summon the Reaver under 2 conditions. The first, his damage must be at 0%. This would be similar to how Link's forward smash gets a projectile aspect at 0% damage, reflecting a mechanic in the Legend of Zelda games. Raziel would only be able to summon the Reaver Blade when at full health in Soul Reaver. If he takes damage, he will be unable to summon the Reaver. Once summoned, Raziel is able to use the Reaver until he takes damage, allowing the player to deal heavy damage from the outset of the match, as opposed to his claws. While the Reaver is being used, it will drain a meter, located next to Raziel's damage meter. This meter will drain more quickly over time depending on how frequently Raziel uses the Reaver. Once it's depleted, the Reaver will automatically dispose. The other condition would be more of a comeback mechanic. Raziel could begin the match without summoning the Reaver, and over the course of the match, and assuming to be taking damage, build up the Reaver meter to finally be able to summon it. These 2 options would allow Raziel to take 2 different approaches to combat. Go for hard reads and few combo strings towards the beginning of the match, or more swiftly rack up damage and deliver a killing stroke once the Reaver meter is summoned. This is reflected in the Soul Reaver games, where Raziel can quickly subdue enemies with a Reaver execution, but can more safely secure a kill through building up to it with chip damage. If Raziel does not have sufficient health or Reaver charge, his neutral special will summon one of 3 staffs found in the Soul Reaver games. Raziel uses a wide selection of ornate staffs, rods, and spears throughout Soul Reaver that he uses to dispatch his vampire foes. The staffs can be used to extend his range and output of damage, or be thrown like a projectile for devastating kill potential. In the same manner as his game counterpart, Raziel will widen his stance and, using telekinesis, summon a staff into his hand. This staff will alter his attack patterns and the amount of damage he deals, trading his swift claw attacks for slower and heavier spear strikes. If Raziel presses the neutral special button again, he will throw the spear forward in one of 8 directions if a directional input is held after. The spear will remain in place wherever it stops, whether hitting a wall or an enemy. If Raziel loses the spear, he will have to wait a short duration of time before summoning another one. He cannot summon another spear while the previous one is still present on the stage. Raziel also cannot pick up another weapon until he loses possession of the staff. Side Special. Raziel's side special has a number of variations, depending on his weapon status and his proximity to enemies. If Raziel is standing alone, he will pull down his cowl and draw souls in to feed. This ability comes straight from the Soul Reaver games. Raziel will recover incremental portions of damage over time, forcing an opponent to either approach and interrupt the feeding animation, or risk Raziel returning to full health. This will function similarly to the characters like Samus or Cloud, who benefit on charging their neutral special when at a distance. Fortunately for his opponent, however, Raziel's startup and cooldown for this move contain a brief amount of lag, making the risk more balanced for both parties. If Raziel is standing next to an enemy, he will perform what is known in fighting games as a command grab, or an attack that grabs the opponent with an input other than the conventional grab input. His command grab is called Sip. This technique was utilized in the Human Citadel and Soul Reaver, or on humans who submitted to Raziel. Raziel would embrace the human and drink, in a manner of speaking, their soul from their neck. This technique would function similarly to Robin's aptly named move, Nosferatu, draining the opponent of their damage and restoring it to Raziel. Depending on the duration the player holds side special, Raziel may indulge a further drink, assuming his opponent doesn't mash out. A short drink will leave his opponent stunned for an instant, whereas a long drink will allow them to immediately react and potentially punish if they can mash out of the hold. Raziel's third variation on side special occurs if Raziel is armed with the Soul Reaver and is next to an opponent. This will initiate another command grab, wherein Raziel will tackle his opponent to the ground, plunge the Reaver into them, and allow the Reaver to consume a portion of their soul. This finds its origin in Legacy of Kain Defiance, where Raziel would perform a similar action as an execution move. Rather than heal himself, this move would restore a portion of the Reaver meter. Because the move has such a high startup lag, this is very much a high-risk, high-reward move, and should only be performed by a player that has successfully conditioned their opponent into a hard-read situation. Down special. One of Raziel's most iconic abilities is his ability to shift between two planes of existence, the warped liminal spectral realm and the grounded material realm. Certain abilities available to Raziel in one of these realms may not be available in the other, and vice versa, so this move will have to be used advantageously. While in the spectral realm, Raziel will regain health slowly, imitating the realm's restorative mechanic from the Soul Reaver games. He will also become transparent and be impervious to the opponent's attacks, but conversely will be unable to attack his opponents. He will also pass through platforms without the need to fast fall through them, and will be unable to pick up items or carry items that he is currently holding. Raziel's speed will be briefly augmented to reflect a different passage of time from the material realm. The amount of time spent in the spectral realm will be limited, to ensure that Raziel can't camp out in the spectral realm indefinitely. Much like the game's story, Raziel cannot seek sanctuary in the spectral realm for too long, lest he risk losing himself to the realm's assimilating nature. Raziel can only return back to the material realm via a conduit that will appear at some predetermined position on the stage, similar to Steve's crafting table. Unfortunately, this could lead to Raziel's opponent camping him out on his return to the material realm. This reflects a situation in Soul Reaver, where enemies would sometimes be present within the vicinity of a conduit and sneak in a first strike on your re-entry. Raziel's shifting must be wisely used and with careful discrimination. Fortunately, with a directional input from the player, Raziel can mix up the location of his recovery slightly, and manifest back in a different location, as a throwback to his corpse possession mechanic from Defiance. Up special. Raziel's up special would be Glide. This move was admittedly a bit of a challenge to determine. I was debating whether or not to use the air elemental version of the Soul Reaver for Raziel's recovery move, or just make his shifting ability a teleport move, similar to Mewtwo's, and relegate his glide to a double jump like Peach's float. However, I felt his gliding animation would be most appropriate as a recovery. Raziel's glide is his last resort for recovery, and there are many moments in the Soul Reaver games where you'd wonder if your glide will carry you to your desired destination or cause you to fall and require a redo. Raziel's verticality with his jumps also do a solid job of granting him, much like the game's vertical distance, whereas his wings would allow him to cover more of a horizontal distance. Raziel catches a quick updraft of air, granting him temporary invulnerability. At the peak of his lift, he would open his tattered wings and glide forward with his momentum. Gliding always left you very vulnerable in the Soul Reaver games particularly. To projectiles, a well-aimed hit could easily knock Raziel off of his desired trajectory and send him plummeting, making his recovery options limited. Much like other glide moves, think Steve's recovery or Meta Knights from Brawl, Raziel can alter the path of his flight to avoid obstacles such as this. If Raziel fears an incoming projectile or a soft hit that will disrupt his flight path, the player may opt to shift into the spectral realm. This would have to be engaged prior to Raziel's flight path, which would cost him returning positional advantage and momentum. After shifting into the spectral realm, Raziel can glide freely without worry of being sniped. However, because he is in the spectral realm, Raziel must land on the edge of the stage. If not, he will continue to descend and, unable to grab the ledge, forfeit his recovery. Normals. Raziel's normal attacks are where the presence of the Reaver or a staff begin to stand out more clearly. Raziel's normals are also where his more sophisticated attacks from Defiance start to show up. Jab attack. Raziel's jab is lifted straight from Soul Reaver, 2 consecutive hooks followed by an uppercut that advances him forward. This is Raziel's most basic combo in the Soul Reaver games, and if uninterrupted, would allow him to steadily beat his opponents into submission. Raziel's first 2 hits would link together, and the third strike knocking his enemy back. Raziel would need to dash forward slightly to reach his opponent and potentially continue the combo. If 3 of these combos can be linked together in fairly quick succession, they can eliminate an opponent's shield and stun his enemy, emulating the way Raziel's attacks would stun vampire enemies into a groggy, vulnerable state. Despite doing significant shield damage, Raziel's jabs cannot kill off the side of the stage. Raziel's armed jab would behave similarly, a 1-2-3 hit combo which would see him perform a spin on the last hit. Like the prior combo, this move would not kill, even at high percentages, but in 2 well-timed successions could establish a shield break situation. As with all prior moves, Raziel trades speed and timing for a slight boost to his attack damage. Raziel's jab, while equipped with the Reaver, would be a move straight from Defiance, titled Perforate Carcass. Perforate Carcass was a move that would see Raziel jab his enemy in blindingly rapid succession with the Soul Reaver. In Smash Bros, Raziel would make 2 brief jabs with the Reaver. If the third and subsequent inputs are made, Raziel would unleash a flurry of continuous jabs into his opponent. Raziel could punctuate this with one final jab to launch his opponent. Unlike the prior 2 jab finishers, this move would kill off the side of the stage, but only at exceptionally high damages. Dash attack. Raziel's unarmed and armed dash attacks both come from Soul Reaver 1. Without locking on, Raziel resorts to running strikes with both of his claws. These are glancing blows that, if timed right, can deliver damage while allowing Raziel to move around freely. If cautious execution is not exercised while using this move, Raziel will leave himself vulnerable for a preemptive or a reactionary attack from his opponent. Raziel's armed strike follows the same pattern, a 1-2 strike pattern that allows him to strike while dashing and immediately transition back to running, similar to Mega Man's pellets. While equipped with a staff, this move would act similarly. The staff would simply extend his range and allow a greater capacity for damage, in exchange for slower hits. When Raziel has the Reaver equipped, his dash attacks require more commitment. Raziel plants his legs and somersaults forward, swinging the Reaver overhead as he lands. This move comes straight from Raziel's running attack from Defiance. The move, not unlike the game itself, would leave Raziel wide open for a counterattack. A well-placed attack, though, will do considerable knockback to an enemy. Side tilt. While in the first game most of Raziel's enemies were vampires that required specialized means to kill, Soul Reaver 2 introduced human warriors who could die after sustaining a certain amount of hits. Still, the developers wanted Raziel to perform some kind of execution if he was unarmed, so Raziel was given the ability to puncture his enemy's heart with his claws. Raziel's puncture attack, as it will be called, functions similarly. This move would be the most effective as a combo finisher or a way to output moderate damage with moderate risk. Raziel would summon energy into his hand, and then thrust it forward straight into his opponent's chest. While lighter foes could be KO'd off the side of the stage, heavier enemies would not lose a stock until extremely high percentages. Raziel's armed side attack will simply cause him to throw his staff forward. For that matter, Raziel will throw his staff in whichever direction is held when using a tilt attack and armed with a staff, much like his neutral bait. Because Raziel must remain stationary when throwing his staff, so he must remain in Smash Bros. In other words, pressing an attack input while moving forward would just result in a dash attack, rather than a throw. This would also apply to other melee items in the game. Down tilt. Raziel's unarmed down tilt would feature him scraping the floor with his claws. While no exact move in Soul Reaver is referenced here, a precedent for it exists in a cutscene towards the game's finale. While pursuing Cain through Mobius's lair, Raziel kneels down and swipes at the floor beneath him. I imagine this move would function similarly as a soft hit, causing Raziel's opponent to be briefly popped up, leading into a combo, similar to Little Mac's down tilt. Outside of the direct hit, some sparks would leap out from where Raziel's claw made contact with the ground. I imagine that these would create a slight stunning effect similar to the tail of Lucas's PK Thunder. Raziel's down tilt while equipped with the Soul Reaver functioned similarly to the unarmed iteration. This move would be lifted straight from Defiance's Shatter Spirit technique that has Raziel bring down the Reaver into the ground to launch his opponent skyward. This would allow for some degree of combo routes if spaced properly. Unlike the armed version, Raziel would likely have to combo off this move with an aerial move, considering the trajectory at which his opponent is launched. The move would create a small soft spot shockwave, doing light damage and knockback to an opponent not caught in the direct path of the swing. Up tilt. Both Raziel's armed and unarmed version of this move contain no connections to an in-game technique. I had briefly considered using a glyph or air reaver spell for this move, not ultimately settled on an original idea, counter to Raziel's force scrape ability. I felt this move would be most appropriate to keep Raziel's tilts relegated to previous forms of attacks. The unarmed version of the move would see Raziel swipe up and deliver a soft hit to an opponent that could be followed up into another combination. The Reaver's up tilt would show Raziel swiping towards the sky above him, delivering slightly more range and damage. Combinations off this move would be difficult yet possible, as the Reaver's main purpose is to inflict damage and knockback, rather than chain moves together. With a wider range than his unarmed up tilt, this move would prove excellent for sharking platforms and preventing incoming aerial attacks, functioning like sword attacks for most of the Smash roster. Neutral aerial. Raziel's neutral air attack would be a spinning slash, Borrowing from his Soul Reaver 2 moveset, this move was a follow-up to some of Raziel's combo starters. This move had the capacity to knock enemies to the ground, and would function similar to his Smash iteration as well. Ness's neutral air provides a good template for this move, a brief, short-range spinning aerial move with lots of potential as both an offensive or defensive attack. Raziel's armed neutral air is a staff spin. It is nearly identical to his unarmed neutral air, the only change being the range and offensive capabilities. This move pulls from Soul Reaver 1, resembling the third attack in Raziel's 1-2-3 attack combo when armed with a spear. With a slightly higher cooldown, it would prove very effective at keeping enemies out of range while airborne. Raziel's neutral air with the Reaver would borrow its function and namesake from the gameplay of Legacy of Kain Defiance. Phantasmal Tempest, as it was called, was a mid-air attack Raziel employed to end the combo and send his foes flying after a mid-air flurry of hits. While not much different visually than the prior two variants of his neutral air, this one would demonstrate significantly greater knockback potential, with the capacity to secure kills off stage if landed appropriately. Forward aerial. Raziel's forward air attack would be a simple claw slash. While Raziel does not necessarily have a claw slash move in-game, he does have a leaping takedown in Soul Reaver 2 that he performs on enemies while unarmed. This move shows Raziel striking forward with both claws and opening his victim's chest with one motion. His forward air would not be nearly as devastating, being performed with only one claw. The move would send opponents forward on a late hit and send them down a short distance on an early hit, like Mario's forward air, giving it limited spiking capabilities. Raziel's armed forward air would be Ghoul Piercer. This move gets its name from a mission in Vordor's mansion from Defiance. In the mission, Raziel is tasked with impaling 3 statues with ornate spears. Like his prior move, this move would have an early and a late hit, but also a sweet spot that would perform a devastating spike or unleash grievous damage on his opponent's shield. Raziel's Reaver forward air would be Imperial Rending. This move's name is borrowed straight from Raziel's special techniques from Defiance and has combo potential. For Raziel's Smash iteration, I felt it would be appropriate to allow the move to chain together with other moves if spaced properly. Raziel would swing the Reaver down, this time with no sour spot or late hits, though with a more sizable startup time. This move would spike opponents, bounce opponents off the ground for combos, and break shields potentially in one hit if a tipper lands. The trade-off would be the move's landing lag, really forcing the Raziel player to strike only when the time is right. Up air. Raziel's up air would borrow from a somewhat unexpected source, his brood, the Raziel Limb. Unseen for almost all the Legacy of Kain games, the Raziel Limb were first introduced in the spin-off game Nosgoth. While a divisive title amongst fans and a far cry from the single-player, narrative-driven games that define the series, Nosgoth was at one point considered a canon Legacy of Kain title, and did have an official Legacy of Kain artist consulting on character designs. Therefore, referencing this game would make for at least a mostly authentic source. The Raziel Limb take off from the ground, producing a shockwave and damaging enemies who come too close. Raziel would imitate this move, having a small hitbox by his sides, and a larger one covering his body briefly for the initial burst upwards. Depending on whether used on the ground or in the air, would affect Raziel's lift height. An aerial up air would result in a short burst that could provide Raziel some verticality and protection on his return to the stage. One performed from the ground would thrust Raziel high above his starting point, making this a burst option to preemptively strike airborne foes. Down aerial. Raziel's down air moves are all based on a piece of concept art I had found by series artist Daniel Kabuko while he was working on Defiance. I would assume that this move was cut because it was considered redundant with another one of his moves, or to make Raziel more similar to Kain's fighting style. In either case, it looks like this would have been an interesting attack, and something that would feel right at home with Raziel's down aerial attack. The unarmed version of the move borrows its name, like Raziel's up air, from the spin-off Nosgoth title. In this game, the Raziel Limb would dive towards the ground and land, creating a shockwave. While Raziel wouldn't spiral downwards, the move would function similar in that he would make a sudden physical contact with the ground, and his impact would affect nearby opponents. Raziel would be locked into a sudden descent, much like Sora's down air, creating a soft hitbox on his descent and shockwave, and a more hard-hitting strike on the immediate location of his landing. Raziel's armed down air, Stake Driver, would ultimately see him follow the same motion. He would raise his spear, descend swiftly, and impact the ground. While Raziel doesn't necessarily perform this move neither in-game or in a cutscene, I imagine this to be another loose interpretation of the mission where he impales the statues in Vordor's mansion. In addition to a slightly larger impact, Raziel's staff would do significant percent and shield damage at the tip. Raziel's Reaver-equipped down air would be called Reaver Slam. Following the exact same path and motion as the prior two variants of the move, this would be the most faithful to its concept sketch. The end of the move sees Raziel driving the Reaver into the ground, up to its hilt. The resulting force generates a shockwave, larger than the other two versions, resulting in greater recoil on Raziel's part. Back aerial. Raziel's sole back air move has him perform a kick. While the move is typically performed on a front-facing enemy in Soul Reaver 2, the opening cutscene to the game shows Raziel perform a variant of this kick, spinning before landing the blow. To this end, I envision the move as being a strike behind Raziel as opposed to his front. With little kill potential, the move's utility would be to interrupt rear-approaching enemies or to set up other moves, allowing for combo potentials if spaced properly. Because the move does not set up a tumble situation, if used close to the ground, Raziel may be able to grapple his opponent immediately after, calling back once again the Soul Reaver 2 intro. Smash attacks. Impale moves. I decided to relegate all of Raziel's smash attacks towards some form of impaling move. After beating vampire enemies into a groggy state, Raziel would employ some form of execution move to kill them. While a number of tools are usually at his disposal, Raziel's most common method of ending his foes would usually be a good old-fashioned stake to the heart. Raziel can impale with the staff in 4 different directions, 2 sides, 1 upward, and 1 downward. A forward impale would lift the opponent and launch them forward and slightly upwards. An upward impale would send his opponents along a slightly higher trajectory than the forward impale, but miss opponents directly in front of Raziel. The downward impale would work well for striking grounded opponents or opponents near the ledge, bouncing opponents upwards or spiking them respectively. Like the Soul Reaver games, however, the hitbox for these moves would be narrow. Missing one of these would leave Raziel wide open for an attack if they are not carefully lined up. Forward smash. Raziel's unarmed forward smash would be his telekinetic projectile. This move would show Raziel compress an area of space above his head and push it forward, quickly knocking away enemies to either gain ground on them or to push them towards a trap. While the move itself doesn't kill, its potential for launch is what I felt made it appropriate as a smash attack. Plus, it will often lead to a kill in Soul Reaver if there is a hazard nearby such as water or a wall spike. This move would boast slightly above average range as far as smash attacks go, and allow Raziel to angle the move up or down to strike an opponent that is in the air or on a lower line of sight than Raziel. The move would have a small zone of effect, similar to Mega Man's forward smash, and although it would cover a great distance, a quick-thinking opponent could easily slip past and punish Raziel. Based on the same control put as the telekinetic projectile, Raziel's forward smash when equipped with the Reaver would launch a Reaver bolt. The Reaver bolt is similar to the telekinetic projectile in knockback and trajectory, and would also maintain the slight angling of the move. The biggest difference would be the damage output. In Soul Reaver, the move would only require a couple hits to disable an enemy, making it effective when used from a distance. With its significant end lag, however, a tactical approach could prove unwise for a player that abuses this move. As the move uses the Reaver's energy more significantly than his tilts and jabs, all Reaver smash attacks would burn up significantly larger portions of the Reaver gauge. Down smash. Throughout Soul Reaver, Raziel employs the use of glyph magic, or spells set in Nosgoth's lore that adhere to a certain element or idea. Among them is the Stone Glyph, in which Raziel channels elemental energy into the ground beneath him, generating a shockwave. Being that most of Raziel's enemies consist of vampires, they would not entirely succumb to this move alone, instead perishing from his fire, sunlight, or water glyphs instead. However, the Stone Glyph does immediately result in a stunned state from his enemies. As such, this move would do significant shield damage to a defensive foe, much like Sephiroth's down smash. When equipped with the Reaver, Raziel's down smash would instead reference a move from Legacy of Kain Defiance. When endowed with the element of Earth, Raziel could plunge his Reaver into the ground to generate an earthquake and floor enemies. I imagine this would function similarly to his Stone Glyph move, but with a wider area of effect, greater knockback, and greater shield break potential. The largest difference would be the active hitbox next to Raziel, as he plunges the Reaver into the ground. Up smash. Raziel's up smash would adhere to another of his elemental abilities, the Fire Glyph. In Soul Reaver, Raziel amasses a ball of fire above his head and unleashes it, setting his enemies ablaze. It would function similarly in Smash, differing only in its area of effect. Rather than an all-encompassing flame, the radius of attack would be smaller and only exist above Raziel. While the startup and end lag of the move would leave Raziel exceptionally vulnerable, its capabilities for covering platforms would make it a very useful tool. Raziel's up smash while equipped with the Reaver would have him summon the Fire Reaver spell, an ability taken directly from Defiance. Raziel would wave the Reaver in a circular motion above him, before releasing a wall of flame. As with all of his prior attacks, a trade-off of startup lag, damage output, and knockback would result. This effect would also last slightly longer than the Fire Glyph. Grabs and throws. Grab attack. All vampires in the Legacy of Kain universe have telekinetic capabilities. Raziel's telekinetic capabilities allow him to hold his enemies in a stasis field in Defiance, shortly before launching them. Raziel's range when pulling in enemies is very extensive, which would be reflected in the range of his grab in Smash gameplay. To balance this, some startup lag and significant end lag would be assigned to this move. Raziel would reach out with his arms and pull an enemy towards him. A successful grab would be denoted by a light emanating from his opponent. Pummel. In Legacy of Kain Defiance, Raziel does not pummel his enemies, opting rather to hit them with a number of strikes from the Reaver instead. To keep his pummel consistent whether armed or not with the Reaver, he will actually use an ability from Soul Reaver 2, a Claw Strike. Raziel would use this as an execution-style move on many of the human enemies from Soul Reaver 2, puncturing their heart and dispatching them. While not as devastating as its game counterpart, Raziel would repeatedly strike the opponent with the tip of his claws, inflicting small increments of damage on them. Forward Throw. In Defiance, if Raziel opts not to strike or release his enemy from the stasis field, he possesses a third option to throw his enemy. This option can be used to space enemies out if Raziel is overwhelmed, or cast enemies into a hazard, either a lethal fall or a wall spike. For Raziel's forward throw, he would employ a similar telekinetic launch that would send his opponent hurtling away from him. While this move does have potential to kill off the side of the stage, it would more likely result in Raziel just placing his opponents in a disadvantageous state, where he would kill with a follow-up move instead. Back throw. Raziel's back throw would have him lift his opponent above his head and carry them, while they would wriggle to free themselves. In Soul Reaver, after Raziel has inflicted sufficient enough damage to stun his enemy, he is able to lift them above himself and throw their body into a lethal hazard. To match this move's killing potential in Soul Reaver, this is a move that could kill off the side. I was initially considering this move for Raziel's forward throw. However, as most Soul Reaver players know, you're almost never facing the intended hazard that will end your enemy. So, to emulate this experience and provide an opponent with a sufficient amount of time to break free, Raziel will sometimes need to turn around in order to throw an opponent he has cornered. If Raziel has not sufficiently damaged his opponent, they will have ample time to break free. However, if they are at a severe level of damage, he will be able to easily turn and hurl them into the blast zone. Likewise, the greater damage his opponent has, the less likely they will be able to wriggle free from the hold. Finally, unlike Donkey Kong's cargo throw, Raziel will be unable to carry his opponent in the air, dropping them if he ventures too far off the edge of the stage. Down throw. The ability to pull someone's soul from their corpse is one that is referenced a number of times in the Legacy of Kain series. From Blood Omen with Mortanius fusing Malik's soul to his own armor, to Raziel's execution moves in Defiance. Even Dead Sun, an unfinished Legacy of Kain game cancelled in 2013, showed some form of its Raziel-like protagonist grabbing hold of an enemy's soul as an execution move. Raziel's Soul Snatch would see him pull the opponent's soul from their body while simultaneously discarding their corpse. The opponent would bounce away and have a short amount of recovery time to recompose while Raziel is stuck in end lag. Still, they would receive more damage than Raziel's other throws, making this one of the more effective throws in racking up damage. Up throw. Arguably one of Raziel's most grueling tasks are the block puzzles from Soul Reaver 1. Because of his vampiric strength, Raziel is able to dig his claws into impossibly heavy metallic boxes and move them to unlock doors and reach higher vantage points. If a block needs to be rotated, Raziel is essentially able to position his claws underneath it and deadlift the block, flipping it over. With significant ease, he would do the same to his opponents in Smash Bros, launching them high into the air even at lower percentages. While the move has little kill potential, it is a funny nod and a perfect fit towards one of the more lacking aspects of the Soul Reaver games. Final Smash. Near the end of Defiance, Raziel imbues the Soul Reaver with the spirits of all prior Pillar Guardians. After this, he stumbles upon Mobius' soul in the Spectral Realm, and runs him through with the Augmented Blade. Briefly, the Spirit Reaver, as it was called, allows Mobius to behold the grotesque form of the Elder God before Raziel devours his soul. Raziel's Final Smash would function similarly, with Raziel impaling his opponent with the Spirit Reaver. A brief cutscene would play out similar to the one in Defiance, with the opponent observing the horrific tentacled mass of the Elder God, before Raziel consumes their soul. Raziel's Final Smash will have no effect on enemies if used in the Spectral Realm, but will affect another Raziel player in the Spectral Realm at the same time. Movement. Raziel's movement as a character can be described as smooth and acrobatic, calling to mind Marvel heroes such as Spider-Man and Nightcrawler, who are arguably influences for his design. Coupled with his wings and tangential bonds with the physical world, Raziel has a wide array of mobility for strategic attacks and maneuvers. Crouch and crawl. Raziel's crouch animation is pulled straight from the Soul Reaver games. Crouching doesn't do much for combat, but it does allow him to place staves and spears on the ground. It also allows him to enter a crawling animation. Once again, while not exceptionally useful, it does allow Raziel to approach edges more finely and carefully than walking. In Smash, it would allow Raziel to potentially low-profile attacks that would otherwise land if he were standing, while simultaneously covering ground on an opponent. Sneak. Raziel's sneaking ability holds the same value as his crawl, preventing him from slipping off ledges but also allowing him to approach and impale enemies without notice. This move would not offer much in terms of combat advantage in Smash Bros, but would be a cool little throwback to the games. Walk. Raziel's walking animation sees him calmly swing his arms at his side, and would mostly feature during cutscenes in Soul Reaver after Raziel has entered through a door or a portal. Its purpose in combat would not be anything special outside of faking out an opponent expecting a more rapid approach. Outside of this, it's just a funny callback to his walk cycle from Soul Reaver 1. Run. Raziel's run has him advance forward at a moderately quick pace. His gait was picked up slightly in Defiance, but I think most fans are more used to the steady scrape of his foot claws against stone. Therefore, the animation would more closely resemble his running animation from Soul Reavers 1 and 2. Jumps. When a jump command is held in midair in any of the Legacy of Kain games, Raziel will glide rather than execute a midair jump like other characters. This made it somewhat difficult to choose a midair jump for him, as flapping his ragged wings did not really seem like a feasible option. Then, I remembered this scene from the opening to Soul Reaver 2. In the intro, Raziel chases Kain up a flight of stairs to a portal and, following his first jump, leaps into a front flip. This is probably the closest Raziel would get to a double jump throughout the entire series, but I think eagle-eyed fans would appreciate the reference. Landing. Also referencing the opening to Soul Reaver 2 is Raziel's landing animation. Sticking the landing to the somersault, Raziel lands in your stereotypical superhero landing pose, on a knee and a foot with a hand planted in front of him. This is another small reference that would probably be lost on casual fans, but would be a nice touch for dedicated consumers of Legacy of Kain content. Wall Cling. Wall Cling is perhaps the first of Raziel's movement options that proves of tactical advantage. Some characters in Smash Bros, such as Sheik or Lucario, are able to cling to walls, staggering their return to stage and providing them with an opportunity to plan their recovery. Raziel's Wall Cling references an ability he obtains from his brother Zephon, an ability to scale walls with ridges. While not able to climb walls in Smash Bros, Raziel would be able to take hold of the wall and return to stage if the glide carries him too low. If Raziel is in the Spectral Realm, however, he may not be so lucky. Hit Stun. Raziel's Hit Stun references a visual cue from the first Soul Reaver when he is struck by an enemy. In the game, a red flash comes from Raziel's upper body, and teal spectral energy sprays from the area of impact like blood. Raziel also staggers backwards slightly, recoiling from the strike. Knockback. If a hit is sufficient to lift Raziel off the ground, he will enter his knockback animation. This animation is lifted straight from Defiance, and would show Raziel reeling as he flails to regain balance. While in this animation, a teal glow would emanate from Raziel's torso to indicate his tether to the material realm is fleeting. Tumble. Raziel's tumble animation is both a visual callback and a pun on the opening to Soul Reaver. After being cast into the Lake of the Dead, Raziel describes his descent as tumbling, burning. There are quick glimpses of his corpse being slowly dissolved by the caustic properties of the lake, one of which I referenced for this animation. Flop. Raziel's flop animation takes place if he falls to the ground without reacting. In Defiance, this animation isn't necessarily the flop animation he would receive after being knocked to the ground, but rather the position he lays in after being defeated by Janos Aldrin in battle. Much like that cutscene, spectral energy would be seen floating off of Raziel's form as he lays still. Shield. Raziel's shielding animation represents his blocking animation from Soul Reaver 2. While never particularly known for its depth of combat, Soul Reaver 2 did make slight advances over the first game with some brand new mechanics such as blocking. Raziel would hold up a sword with one hand and brace it with the other, protecting himself from an incoming strike. Raziel would imitate this stance in Smash Bros, whether holding a weapon or not. Parry. Raziel's parry animation also holds its roots in Soul Reaver 2. When recoiling from a heavy hit in Soul Reaver 2, Raziel remains fairly stiff. However, I thought that the visual of a heavy strike looked similar enough to the particle effect present when parrying in Smash Bros, so I referenced the reaction to a heavy attack in his pose for parrying. Roll. Raziel's rolling animation comes straight from Defiance. Raziel has exhibited other examples of dodging in the Legacy of Kain games, skipping laterally, jumping, and most effective of all, shifting briefly into the Spectral Realm. Even Raziel's brother Malchiah makes use of this technique during their boss fight to pass through gates. Still, a leaping roll felt as though it would fit best for Raziel's acrobatic style of movement. Whereas rolls worked best on the ground, Raziel's air dodge looked very much at home alongside the likes of Mewtwo and Mithras. Temporarily becoming intangible, Raziel would pass through his opponent's strike, with ethereal energy lifting off him where the attack makes contact. This would reference Raziel's phasing technique that he would gain from Malchiah, where he would press against a gate and pass through it in a T-pose position. Gimmicks. Insubstantial edifices. Referencing a line delivered by the Elder God, insubstantial edifices refer to the climbable walls in Soul Reaver 1 and 2. These surfaces, while functional in the material realm, were unusable in the spectral realm, and would not allow Raziel to climb their sheer surfaces. In Defiance, while walls did become climbable in the spectral realm by some shoehorned lore justification, this was really just done to homogenize gameplay between Kain and Raziel. So I prefer to take the Soul Reaver 1 and 2 approach to scalable walls. If while off stage Raziel shifts for a safer recovery back to stage, he will only successfully recover if his glide takes him directly to the ledge. If he recovers underneath the ledge, the insubstantial edifices mechanic will cause him not to initiate his wall cling animation, and he will fall into the blast zone, resulting in a KO. Reaver Tax. The Reaver Tax is perhaps Raziel's most limiting gimmick. In the Soul Reaver games, merely existing in the material realm is a challenge for Raziel. In addition to this, manifesting the Reaver will drain his strength, making a shift to the spectral realm an inevitability at some point. To offset this, Raziel must feed throughout the game to maintain his health. In order to reflect this, Raziel will take continuous incremental damage throughout the course of the match, maybe every couple seconds. This will begin either after he takes his first hit of damage, or if he immediately summons the Reaver. Think of this as Pichu's damage trade-off, except rather than incurring damage from an attack, Raziel will simply take damage over the course of time. This will create a challenge where the player must use his side B move to recover incremental damage at points, or try to take his opponent's stock before he accrues too much damage. When using the Reaver, this chip damage is accelerated, multiplying the rate at which Raziel takes damage. While still incremental, it will force the player to make every hit with the Reaver count. Crouch Jump. Those who played the first two Soul Reaver games know that Raziel's crouch and sneak animations function nearly identical except for one key mechanic. When crouching, Raziel gains significant vertical height if executing a jump immediately after. This would allow Raziel to leap to heights and explore some areas previously impossible to reach with a standard jump. Raziel's Smash Bro gameplay would allow him to increase his initial jump height as well. While not necessarily an inherently beneficial option, this would add an additional variation to the way Raziel approaches combat. With a single jump, he would be able to reach the top platform of Battlefield, or set himself up to strike an enemy approaching from high above. In conjunction with his second jump, Raziel's jumps could boast some of the highest verticality in the game. The crouch jump would come at some cost to his forward momentum, giving the player a choice between an upwards or a forwards aerial approach. Fettered too long. Until Defiance, Raziel could exist indefinitely within the spectral realm, regaining strength until his health is full. However, in Defiance, the properties of the spectral realm change, and instead sap Raziel of his strength, much like the material realm had. Additionally, Raziel notes of the spectral realm natives that an extended existence therein could lead him to succumbing to the realm's influence, and becoming one of its mindless denizens. To reflect this in-game, I imagine that Raziel would have a limited amount of time in the spectral realm. Spending more than 5 seconds in his intangible state would cause the controller to vibrate, and Raziel to shimmer, indicating his time is close to an end in the spectral realm. I chose the number 5 to represent the 500 years Raziel spent trapped in the spectral realm, between Soul Reaver 2 and Defiance. After this, Raziel would have 2 seconds to shift back to the material realm. If Raziel cannot or does not shift back, he would freeze up and lose a stock, in a visual manner similar to Hero's thwack move. Insubstantial barriers. Borrowing once again from the Elder God's quotes, insubstantial barriers refer to the grates and gates that Raziel would eventually learn to phase through in the spectral realm. When in the spectral realm, Raziel is not tethered to a physical form, and is therefore able to pass through water and metal bars with little or no resistance. To reflect this in gameplay, Raziel would display a phasing effect when passing through platforms in the material realm. In the spectral realm, Raziel would pass entirely through both thin platforms and water as though they were not there. This would appear visually familiar to the water in the Termina Bay stage from Melee, where players would descend through the water without any friction whatsoever. Raziel, rather than treading water like most other characters, would sink down until he reaches the blast zone. Fire Reaver. The Soul Reaver was augmented with different elemental abilities throughout the Legacy of Kain series. In the original Soul Reaver, however, all but one elemental upgrade was cut, the Fire Reaver. When Raziel discovers the Fire Altar in a sunken abbey, he baptizes the blade in flames, and is then able to set his enemies on fire. After this, he is able to restore fire properties to the blade at any time he is near an open flame. To reflect this in-game, Raziel would need to attack and clank or connect with any open flame source in-game. By doing this, the blade would automatically receive flame properties, able to ignite explosives, fire fire bolts instead of Reaver bolts, and thaw out characters affected by ice properties. The situations for this augmentation would be few and far between, but would be a nice callback to the elemental Reaver enhancements. I was considering including other elemental enhancements to the blade, but because of how situational the Fire Reaver would be alone, and how disproportionate fire moves are compared to other elemental moves in Smash Bros., I felt it would make little sense to include them. Death Cries. So this idea came to me pretty late into making this video, but I thought it would be a fun callback to die-hard Legacy of Kain fans. So when certain enemies are killed in Smash Bros, they have a specific death animation or voice line. Mega Man, for example, bursts into scattering spheres of energy, echoing his death animation from his series. In the intro cinematic to Soul Reaver, voice actor Michael Bell lets out a pretty agonizing scream as Raziel is cast into the abyss. I imagine that if a star KO or a knockout achieved off the top of the screen was made, this voice clip would be reused, and maybe a shortened scream would be repurposed for a side or bottom blast zone knockout. Character animations. Smash Bros. Character animations contain all sorts of allusions to the core game, some being vaguely fitting poses while others are frame-perfect recreations of iconic cutscenes. For Raziel's animation, I picked references that either had a theme to them or related best to the appropriate scenario. Entrance animation. Raziel's entrance would show him gliding onto the stage slowly, emerging from a shifting cloud of amber and green. In the beginning of Soul Reaver 2, after Raziel enters the Chronoplast's time portal, he emerges from the other side in a manner similar from a literal stream of time, where he is greeted by Mobius. Time travel is a consistent theme throughout the Legacy of Kain series, and while I could have easily picked Raziel's resurrection or simply have him shift in from the spectral realm, I felt this entrance would more widely encompass Raziel's character and journey. Taunts. You are worthy. When Raziel first arises from his descent into the underworld, he hears the baritone voice of the Elder God cryptically describing him as worthy. The voice, which seemingly appears to echo from all around Raziel, causes him to dart his gaze in an attempt to find the source. Raziel's taunt would have him perform a similar motion, lowering his stance to demonstrate his alertness as his head pivots about. In addition to being a fun nod to the Soul Reaver intro cinematic, I like the idea of Raziel looking about confused after taking a stock, almost as if to say, "Oh, did I do that? Damn you, Kain." Raziel's second taunt references his first meeting with Kain following his resurrection. Understandably angry with Kain for having murdered him and destroyed his appearance, Raziel's rage is further fueled by the implication that Kain had committed acts of genocide upon Raziel's clan. In response, Raziel rebukes Kain and his decision, pointing angrily at him. Raziel would repeat this motion in-game, though here it would be directed less specifically towards Kain. The Shifter. In the early days of development, Soul Reaver was conceptualized as a title called Shifter. Shifter contained many elements that would later be translated and retrofitted into the Legacy of Kain lore. One of the most notable pieces of concept art for Shifter was this image, which became the basis for one piece of promotional art and for the pose Raziel takes when unveiling his wings to Kain. This pose would be echoed by Raziel's third taunt. Raziel would catch an incoming gust of wind in his wings, which would open up as his arms extended by his sides. Victory screens. Dark Gift. Dark Gifts, as they're referred to in Nosgoth, refer to powers and abilities that vampires inherit and evolve over time. Every time Raziel would vanquish a main boss, he would absorb their soul and along with it some new ability. This cutscene would usually show him taking their soul into his being, and their energy resonating throughout his form. A similar scene to this would be shown in Defiance, when Raziel absorbs the soul of his fifth and final brother Turel. Even though the style of graphics changed in this installment, the core idea is still there. Raziel's victory animation would see the soul of his defeated enemy passing into him, and his body surging with the renewed energy he receives from them. Pillar Stalker. The cover of Soul Reaver 2 features Raziel clinging to one of the 9 pillars of Nosgoth, Soul Reaver summoned. While no scene like this occurs in-game, it is an image that most Legacy of Kain fans are familiar with, and will be the first instance of the pillar assets being used in Smash. Raziel would leap from pillar to pillar before clinging to the last one and drawing the Reaver as the camera freezes. The Descent. When Raziel first awakes from his descent into the abyss, he immediately assesses his new damaged appearance. His loss of flesh and viscera not only cost him his internal organs and his lower jaw, but also his noble demeanor. In an attempt to cover up his now hideous visage, he wraps his clan sash around his face to form a makeshift cowl. The animators were clever to make this a quick motion, so as to mask the beginning and the end of the cowl and leave it somewhat of a mystery where the seam actually sits. Alternate costumes. Raziel's first alternate costume would reference his brother Rahab. A vampire closely associated with the water, he would don a blue cowl and his overall color tone would shift towards the color blue. Raziel's second alternate costume would reference his brother Duma. The Dumahim vampires are the most prolific, appearing across almost every region of the game. Under a violet banner, Raziel's skin would be shifted in correspondence with Duma's clan colors. Raziel's oldest brother Turel would be the inspiration behind his third alternate skin. Evolving bat-like ears and strong telekinetic proclivities, Turel's clan would be the strongest that Raziel would face in Soul Reaver. Their green banners would be absent from the game, as the region was cut during development. But render art and Turel's green accents in Soul Reaver 2 would indicate that green was certainly the color of his brood. The Melchiam are the second most common vampire found in Nosgoth, descended from Raziel's youngest brother Melchiah. Melchiah's clan features zombie-like vampires with sewn-on skin, evoking the likeness of Count Orlok from Nosferatu. To reflect their rotting decay, Melchiah's banner is appropriately colored yellow, and is the basis for Raziel's fourth alternate skin. Raziel's second youngest brother Zephon's appearance alters slightly throughout the games. Some depictions show him with green accents, some with gray, and some with black. In his render art, he appears scaling a wall with some dark blue-green light reflecting off of his armor. To this end, I would ultimately determine that Zephon's official color sits somewhere in a dark teal. So, for Raziel's fifth skin, he would display this color shift. Raziel's sixth alternate costume would actually feature his own clan. Before the Lake of the Dead's effect would fade the color of Raziel's sash, it originally appeared red. Even in the cancelled Nosgoth spin-off game, the remnants of the Raziel Inn would appear with red sashes anchored around their shoulders. So, Raziel's costume would reflect an influence of red across his own form and cowl. The final alternate costume, and the one that contrasts the most from Raziel's others, is his seventh. His seventh costume is based on that of Janos Audrin, the oldest known living vampire in the Legacy of Kain series, and the one from which Kain and his entire lineage descends. Janos features more angelic priest-like qualities than later devolutions of the vampires, featuring white and gold in his appearance. His skin is even a more softer shade of blue than that of Raziel's. Both of these design changes would be reflected in Raziel's cowl and skin, respectively. The land of Nosgoth is a pretty big place, simply put. It exists in multiple iterations across the 5 games, and while there are key landmarks that remain constant, only a few of them are revisited in later titles, being relegated to cameos or brief mentions. Only one constant is repeatedly seen and revisited throughout the series, which I believe makes it the most appropriate choice for the stage setting. Initially posed as a sort of litmus test for the spiritual well-being of Nosgoth, the pillars are later revealed, or retconned depending on your definition, to be a seal that binds the ancient vampire's mortal enemy, the Hilden, in an alternate dimension. There are 9 pillars in the Legacy of Kain games, each corresponding to a force of nature or some type of magical property. The pillars sit on a raised marble platform in the middle of a forest clearing. 8 of the pillars sit around the back half of the platform, surrounding the most important pillar of them all, the Pillar of Balance, for which Kain is responsible. The pillars adopt slight variations to their design throughout the game. In the first game, the raised platform appears significantly smaller and appears to be made of a brighter marble, whereas the brightness and texture of this marble would change in later games. The runes surrounding the Pillar of Balance also change, with Soul Reaver's intro cinematic and in-game assets featuring 2 different patterns. Most notably, however, would be the pillar's property insignia. In Blood Omen, the pillars each featured blatant representations of their corresponding principle, with Mortanius' Death Pillar featuring an image of skulls piled up. Later games would see these designs homogenized and simplified, with runes representing them instead. The Balance Pillar, for example, would adopt a triangular symbol, representing both stability and a fulcrum upon which weights are balanced. The pillars would cycle through each of the eras visited in the Legacy of Kain series, giving a full span of their evolution throughout the series and highlighting critical moments from its history. The pillars would start off in the daytime in Nosgoth's pre-Blood Omen era. Here the pillars are pristine and unaffected by any sort of corruption or damage. Soon, however, night would fall. For a while things would remain the same, until corruption creeps over the pillars, giving them an uneven dark gray appearance. This would represent the murder of Ariel, the prior Balance Guardian to Kain, and how Nupraptor, her lover and fellow Pillar Guardian, would drag the rest of the circle down into madness, thus tainting them. The 4th stage of the timeline would see the seal of the pillars broken, as Kain refuses to sacrifice himself to restore them. A bright light flashes across the pillars as they are cut down and slightly tilted askew. The final evolution of the stage would see the rise of Kane's Sanctuary of the Clans, present in the Soul Reaver intro and in the game. The tile design on the floor of the sanctuary would manifest first. Then the pillars would sport a worn, sickly off-white, and Kane's throne would emerge from the base of the Pillar of Balance. This would remain as the final state of the stage until the match concludes. I imagine that much like Sora's Hollow Bastion stage, each portion of the stage would be tied to a percentage of the remaining time or the amount of stocks left, with the Sanctuary of the Clans appearing in a last stock or a last few seconds scenario. The stage would not feature any bottom blast zones, just upper and side. Initially, I had considered the Lake of the Dead as a stage with its drop-off points and water hazards, but the pillars constantly shifting and changing ended up being a much more fun idea to draw and animate, and felt much more like a love letter to the entire series than just the first Soul Reaver game. The Omega version of the stage would see a raised platform, high above the skies of Nosgoth. While the dais of the stage has not shown itself to be separate from the ground, it is known that the pillars do extend underground to another chamber in Soul Reaver 2, so this would still be accurate to the games. The battlefield version of the stage would feature 3 platforms, each with the dais' runes wrapped around the perimeter. Both versions of the stage would also feature the aforementioned changes over time, from the Blood Omen era to the Sanctuary of the Clans era. Music. The Legacy of Kain series is not without its flaws, and while the music has a healthy selection of bangers from pulse-pounding battle themes to poignant emotional pieces, it has garnered some criticism for its soundtrack at times. Some themes contain repetitive sound samples or contain such exotic music choices that the average ear might not be conditioned to. This doesn't necessarily make any of the Legacy of Kain music inherently bad by any means, but in a combat scenario, the player might want to listen to something that fits the mood better. So I went through the themes from Soul Reaver and picked only songs that I felt belonged in fighting sequences. In Smash Bros, many tracks are remixed for the release of new DLC. To emulate this experience, I picked some remixes from a couple of my favorite Legacy of Kain fan musicians, both to add an extra layer of flavor to the Pillar stage and also to bring some awareness to their work. I hope you enjoy. The final track, in my opinion, had to be a solid remix of Ozar Midrashim, Raziel's theme song as performed by Information Society. There are a plethora of good remixes of this song, ranging from dance tracks to metal performances. However, I wanted to use a remix that I felt added enough new features to the track while still respecting the original's composition. I also wanted to use one that the original artist was cool with me using for the video, like the other borrowed tracks. So here is Serch Boogie's version of Ozar Midrashim, Raziel's theme. that just about wraps up the video. Did you agree with my choices for each move, or would you have picked something else? If you made it this far, why not leave a comment below explaining your answer? Maybe you would have switched one of Raziel's moves out for another one, or maybe you just hate the fact that I made his toes white instead of blue. Looking at you, Raina Aldrin. And while you're doing that, maybe give this video a like and subscribe to my channel. I'd really appreciate that. I'll be honest and say I was starting to think that this video was never going to be made. Between the different types of content I was looking to make on this channel and other forces in my life competing for my attention, it bothered me that I wasn't going to continue making Smash Bros. Wishlist DLC videos. But with the recent surfacing of new Legacy of Kain projects, I felt incredibly motivated to make this video, which I think stands as a testament to how impactful this series was on me and countless other Legacy of Kain fans. I think it's a series that is long overdue for new life, and with renewed interest in the series, hell, maybe we'll see Raziel in a new Smash Bros. Iteration. Until the next video, take care, and I'll see you all then.